Welcome back to the A Winter of Discontent podcast. In our last episode, we covered the worldview of national conservatism and how it differs substantially from the standard liberal outlook on politics, pluralism, and what it means to live a good life. The next two episodes are a two-part mini-series on national conservative political positions. In this first one, we will discuss national conservative positions on trade, industry, labor, immigration, antitrust, culture, the family, and natalism. So let's dive in and learn how the national conservative vision of the good life translates into real world policy.
The National Conservative good life conception of politics, as we mentioned in the last episode, is definitely going to come up again here, and we're going to see how it comes up and the interesting ways in which it differs from a lot of normal conservative political positions. And I think just jumping right into it, one interesting thing that we're going to see a lot more of is government intervention into the market and the society. Because after all, remember, from the good life view of politics, there's one way that the nation is supposed to conduct itself, that citizens are supposed to conduct themselves. There's one single understanding of the national interest. And so naturally, certain positions, come out of that, and certain understandings of how the nation should operate, given that there's one correct position, sort of become apparent in national conservative thought.
Yeah, and I think specifically we can understand that if there is one good life, good conception of politics, and there's one correct form of morality, this requires the government to intervene in the marketplace and society to ensure they both align with the interests of the nation and its culture. And in practice, this basically means an economically centrist sort of policy, and on the social side of things, maybe a socially conservative right-wing policy. And I think from there, we can get right into specific issues, starting with trade.
Yeah, I mean, trade touches on a bunch of different Nat Con concerns, and it really shows off the way in which Nat Cons are economic nationalists. And that sort of is like the idea of, in economics, the nation and the national interest needs to get put forward first, beyond sort of like market fundamentalism or like ideas of free trade. Especially when it comes to trade, the Nat Con view is very in favor of protectionism. They would say the nation's capabilities need to be maintained, and this means industry needs to be kept inside the country. No offshoring, no friend-shoring, no near-shoring. All industry needs to be maintained in the country so the country can have the industrial capacity to face challengers. Agriculture and food security need to be protected. We shouldn't be importing food from anywhere else. That means that the nation can be held hostage by other people who might cut off its food supply. So therefore, anti-free trade, anti-globalization, this is seen as taking away national sovereignty and giving it either to other countries or to multinational institutions like the WTO, the World Trade Organization, or the UN, which is seen as dangerous and against the national interest.
Right. And this penchant for economic nationalism, desire to protect, domestic industries and in domestic sort of like companies from foreign competition really leads to quite a slew of policy tools that are often used by Nat Cons. These include tariffs, to protect from foreign competition and to stimulate domestic production, industrial policies and subsidies to promote certain, areas and develop certain areas of the economy that are viewed as necessary and good for the nation, and maybe restrictions on imports, like import quotas and other restrictions on allowing what is allowed inside the country and what can be imported inside the country. And maybe some examples we've seen are maybe most prominently, I think we can understand, Trump's tariffs are the most common instance of a national conservative trade policy. Big tariff walls were erected about a year ago under Liberation Day to ostensibly to protect American industry, to prevent the offshoring and the deindustrialization that's been happening in the last few decades, and to bring back industry to America. And there's a lot of proponents of this policy that you may have heard of, or you might find out, like academic people like Orrin Cass, who runs American Compass, sort of national conservative, economically nationalist think tank. Maybe Lighthizer, the former U.S. trade representative. There's quite a few, and J.D. Vance maybe is the other most prominent example of economic nationalism.
Mm-hmm. And of course, this naturally ties in with industrial policy and policy towards industry. I mean, you can say that if Nat Cons or anything, they're very pro-manufacturing. When they're talking about like preserving, national capabilities, they don't mean like, people working at like Starbucks or Walmart. They mean like factories or farmers, essentially.
Right.
And so therefore they make economic policies reflecting these concerns. There is sort of, as we mentioned in the last episode, kind of this, not really this concern that much if tariff policies hurt consumers. There's the idea that at least ideally they were going to be better for industrial workers, and that'll be more helpful to the nation by keeping these capabilities. Maybe people can't buy as many dolls for their kids at Christmas, but your kid only needs one doll and that factory worker needs his job. So we're going to prioritize, that over sort of meaningless material comforts. Again, it's like a disdain for the consumer economy, and this isn't even just like an economic concern entirely. There's a whole cultural component to this as well. A belief that it's more kind of it's better, frankly, in their opinion, to physically produce things. It shows self-sufficiency. It shows, mastery and skill, sort of like particularly like masculine mastery and skill over like the environment, over, like trade policy. And this sort of also goes into how national conservatives will paint a picture of the United States as being in kind of a class war within the country between, the people who, work with their hands, do work for a living, your industrial workers in the Midwest, your farmers, in the Great Plains versus, these sort of like deracinated, sort of, I'm trying to think of a polite way to describe how they think of knowledge workers, or what they would call the professional managerial class, like doctors, lawyers, office workers. They don't think too highly of these kinds of people. They think that they're doing bullshit jobs, that they're just office drones who don't just push around paper and send emails to each other for a living.
Fake email job, basically.
Yeah, fake email job. They call them the professional managerial class, and in a very derogatory sense. And so national conservatives, they want to, help out the blue collar guy, the guy who's really doing something to help the country move forward and help the country stay strong. And they pit that guy as being against these sort of effete urban liberals who just answer the phone all day, or don't even do that, just answer emails all day and don't contribute to the national well-being.
Right. They don't produce anything for the nation. They just, send emails around and fill BS Excel sheets, basically, in their minds. And that's where we can really understand why, for instance, the MAGA movement, in people like Trump and Vance have talked a lot about reshoring, and why they're very critical of the deindustrialization that has happened in the United States since like the 1970s, where they think like this was a, part of national power and national prestige, and the necessity of self-sufficiency for the nation requires the nation to have its own industrial might. And replacing that, we're sending that overseas and then replacing that with a bunch of there's like fake jobs. They like dramatically weakened the country, and we have to basically reverse this sort of trend. I think, we're talking about industry, but you need laborers for that industry. And this is one of the more interesting aspects of the National Conservative political platform, which is compared to other conservatives who are more free market, they're relatively positive towards labor and the working class and unions. And they are generally disagree with, free market conservatives about their disdain for unions. Maybe they're more neutral towards them and think they're fine as long as they work towards the interests of the nation. And because they valorize the working class, there tend to be, supportive of their endeavors to form, unions. And I think maybe Jackson could talk about like specific examples of that.
Yeah, well, I mean, you saw in the 2020 and 2024 elections, and in 2016 as well, Trump does sort of attempt to make outreach to labor unions with varying degrees of success. Um, Particularly in 2024 with the Teamsters unions and with a lot of more construction-related unions, Trump did see a lot of support from them, even from official union leadership, which had long been reluctant to endorse him, even if union rank and file might have felt differently. But you do sort of start to see Trump, coming around on the unions, maybe offering them a seat at the table in some ways. His Secretary of Labor, Chavez Derimer, was significantly more in favor of labor compared to traditional Republican picks for the Department of Labor, who've traditionally really sought to limit the role of that department in what it can do, and what it can do to advocate for workers. Like the National Conservative understanding, it's not quite as pro-union as maybe like socialists or even as traditional liberals tend to think of it. But at the very least, they say there's a place for labor if they're willing to comport themselves in a manner favorable to the national interest.
Yeah, and I think from, trade, industry, and labor, we kind of understand that on the economic issues, national conservatives are more economically centrist compared to, free market, Reaganite sort of conservatism that has existed in America for a while. And this marks like a big break. For the national conservatives, the market is not all good. It's not always great. It only is good if it works for the national interest. And if that means correcting free trade, which is, free markets, beyond our borders, if that means putting tariffs to make sure that our industry doesn't get offshored, a tax, right? Not very free market. And if that means, helping workers in unions or promoting unions, then yeah, they're not going to be so keen on the free market. And they think that, well, the nation's interests matter more than what the market decides.
Mm-hmm.
And right. And I think from there, maybe Jackson, you can start on the big one for national conservatives, immigration.
Yeah. Speaking of doing what's good for the nation rather than what the market decides,
Right.
national conservatives, if you could take everything else away and tell Nat Cons, look, you can pick one part of your platform that you can do. You forget everything else, you can only do one part of it. I would bet you, not all of them, but most of them would say, okay, I want to restrict immigration. That'll be my one thing I get to do. And I'll be happy if I can do that one thing.
Right.
Immigration touches on so many different aspects of NatCon ideology, from their conception of, a single view of the nation to their sort of concern about the balance between capital and labor, to their worry about like different ways of life and things like that. Like immigration is the issue that touches on so many of it, which is probably why it's one of the issues that NatCons care the most about and are the most like sort of vehement about pushing. Like NatCons, and this is one thing that generally is true almost without exception across the entire world, is that national conservative parties tend to be anti-immigration.
Yeah.
Mohammed, you can correct me, but I cannot think of a single national conservative party in the world that is pro-immigration or is even like neutral on it.
No, that's like evil NatCon. No, that's not possible.
Exactly. At that point, you're just not a NatCon if you're not anti-immigration. And in fact, really the only difference between NatCons on the anti-immigration question is how anti-immigration are you?
Yeah.
There'll be your more moderate faction who will say, look, I mean, illegal immigration, absolutely not. We can't have any of that. It's a crime. If you do that, you should be deported. But,
Right.
some legal immigration isn't wrong as long as, it's not too much at once. And as long as they integrate into our culture once they get here, that's fine, I guess. The spectrum then swings all the way to the other direction of people who are like, no, absolutely not. There should be no immigration, legal or illegal, or we should just make it so that you can't legally immigrate to this country. We don't need anybody from overseas. The destabilizing element's going to ruin who our nation is for and what our nation stands for, and we need to shut down the borders entirely, even if it does mean that, we suffer from brain drain or we lose competitiveness.
Yeah, and maybe going off of that, the degree of opposition to legal immigration is in large part a function of who you think belongs to your nation, right? So
Hmm.
for we discussed in our first episode, there are national conservatives who are more moderate and maybe think like, oh, there's like a civic nationalism. That's what we're talking about. And then there's national conservatives who will say, well, no, there's a proper race or ethnicity that belongs in our nation. And for the United States, which we're talking about, there are some national conservatives who would say, well, we want, white people in this country. America is a white country, or, an ethnically European country. And if we're going to allow legal immigration, it's really just going to be those people. And this is on top of the standard sort of national conservative concerns about immigration that, too many immigrants, like legal immigrants, like overwhelm public services or maybe take jobs from natives, depress wages, or their culture, if they're from a foreign culture, they, will have a tough time assimilating. On top of all of those concerns, a more extreme Nat Cons will also play into the sort of nativist argument that, yeah, only like white people or European people should be allowed to be here.
Yeah, the dog whistle they use is the whole heritage American thing, which if you ever hear someone mention the term heritage Americans, I mean, let's just say don't ask them any more about that unless you're really ready to get into a political fight on immigration with them, because that term specifically tends to. I think it's fair to say that if someone mentions heritage Americans, that's kind of a dog whistle for just talking about white Americans, and particularly a very specific subset of white Americans. The idea of heritage Americans, as national conservatives would understand it, is, these are Americans who uh, they've been here for a while, and there's a sliding scale really of like when you draw the line of when someone is like a newer arrival versus a heritage American. It seems to vaguely be like if you arrived sometime before the Civil War, then you're like a real American. You have like ties to
Mm.
the country. And if you arrived after, you're not quite as good as the ones who were here before then. Um, and I'll actually amend my previous earlier statement. It's not just white Americans. They will usually bite the bullet and say that, well, black Americans are also heritage Americans, since they were sort of by necessity mostly came over before the Civil War, or were brought over mostly before the Civil War. But usually when they say, well, we have a preference for heritage Americans, this is usually to say that they have a preference for white Americans, or specifically white Americans who can trace back their lineage to before the Civil War.
Yeah. And, we'd start off the immigration topic here by saying how important this was for the NatCons. And we can really see this when we turn to, the Trump administration, which ideologically aligns most closely with the national conservatives of, any previous administration. And we can see that his immigration policy is probably his most radical, most dramatic, and probably the most long lasting of his policy positions. From what I understand, illegal immigration and legal immigration have dropped dramatically in the last year, maybe 70, 80%. So this is going to be a big deal, right? Especially because we had decently high amounts of legal immigration under like the Biden years, and there was a fair amount of illegal immigration too. So this is like a big deal. Like I mean, people like say like this is the one of, if you're critical of Trump, this is the one campaign promise he kept.
Yeah.
So like from what I understand, there's basically zero illegal immigration across like the southern border of the United States. Um,
Yeah.
but we can kind of understand, like opposition to immigration and refugees is seen across all like national conservative movements, whether or not it's Orban's Hungary or Nigel Farage in Britain or Trump in the United States. And this makes a lot of sense from their perspective. The nation must have borders. The nation must, have a sense of identity too. And that means only people who are acceptable to the people are allowed in. And that means they have to come in orderly. So that's why NatCons focus so much on the immigration question.
Hmm. Yeah, we talked a lot about immigration. Moving on from that to a sort of different aspect of the NatCon platform, among some national conservatives, there's a big focus on antitrust legislation or anti-monopoly legislation, or just legislation in general that puts some restrictions on corporate power or corporate behavior, which a lot of people might find interesting because traditionally this is something that the left has mostly been
Mhm.
an advocate for, especially compared to the mainstream sort of pre-Trump Republican opinion on this, which stated that there should be really, frankly, no, or at the very least, very little, or very few restrictions on corporate behavior because it would get in the
Right.
way of economic growth from their opinion. But Nat Cons, again, they'll go back to this view of the national interest. You know, the nation has its one singular interest, and all Americans, rich and poor, are supposed to comport themselves to that interest, and that includes heads of companies. And so, from the national conservative perspective, corporations don't get a free hand to do whatever they want. They'd prefer the government not, like boss them around all the time. They don't want like a planned economy or anything like that. But they would say, look, like if a corporation wants to, get too big, do a few too many mergers, or maybe like try to get acquired by a foreign company, uh, that's not allowed. The government's going to put some obstacles in the way of that happening, or they're going to directly shut it down. The government might take a certain portion of stock in a company. We saw this with Trump trying to get the
Right.
government to have various sort of proportions of stocks in different companies that are seen as having like a national security interest.
And a
And
golden
so
share.
this is a big change compared to how other conservatives used to operate when it comes to the market and what they thought corporations should and shouldn't be allowed to do. I mean, can you imagine Mitt Romney like saying that the government is going to essentially purchase part of a private corporation
We're
in
gonna
order?
nationalize U.S. Steel, like.
Exactly. I mean, like this is something you would probably expect to hear more from a frankly very left-wing candidate, and that would be a position among the Democrats that would even be on the left of them. So this is one thing where national conservatives are really different from,
Mhm.
a lot of the more conventional both left and right political factions.
Yeah, and we've seen, national conservatives support antitrust action when they believe, the nation state is being threatened by corporate power, and the nation state needs to show who's really the boss, through like certain NatCon political figures like Josh Hawley, JD Vance, and Orrin Cass, some familiar faces. When we talked about economic nationalism and trade and industry, they have all supported stronger antitrust enforcement, and they believe the current like consumer welfare standard, whereby antitrust cases have been litigated against, that's been too weak. They say like that's not the best standard is actually corporate power. If there's too much corporate power, the nation state is threatened. And NatCons have actually even supported left-wing antitrust efforts. A lot of NatCons looked on with approval as the FTC, the agency in charge of antitrust under President Biden, was led by Lena Khan, and she had done a lot of antitrust efforts, and a lot of national conservatives actually applauded her efforts, especially against tech companies, which they viewed as being too powerful.
Mm-hmm. Uh, Now antitrust, that's all well and good, but if you talked to your average NatCon and asked them what they thought the problem was with the country, they're probably not going to immediately name too many tech mergers as being the main
Yeah.
thing. They might say something like culture war issues, which is a huge thing with national conservatives. Again, and I'm sounding like a broken record just saying this over and over again, but it's the important thing to understand. And I think it's an important through line that I hope that people can have begun to notice at this point. National conservatism has one conception of a way the nation is supposed to be, situated and the way people are supposed to behave. And so naturally, when you're in a country with more than one conception of how people ought to behave, this means that you have to fight a culture war. And so national conservatives are very, very, very willing to have the government step in and use their powers to push a certain cultural agenda, even if it's one that's like not very popular or that is very controversial or that has like traditionally been left up to the states. National conservatives would say, this is about the essence of what it means to be an American, and therefore it's absolutely of interest to the government to make sure that the proper essence of Americanism is being
Mhm.
propagated to the new generation. So this means like, stuff like the don't say gay bill in Florida, or, like restricting what can be talked about at what times in classrooms to like which certain groups of students, efforts like the 10 commandments in classrooms, efforts to sort of institutionalize certain views of Christianity, to sort of promote natalism or having big families, to sort of defund certain initiatives or certain civil society initiatives that the government views as being woke, or of pushing what they would say is a divisive understanding of Americanism.
Mhm.
But this is just a really, really big thing for them, and a very, very important part of how they view the nation and how they view their role in preserving and advancing a particular view of the nation.
Right, and I think to add on to that, no, national conservatives believe they are fighting a culture war, going back maybe since like the 60s with like the liberal progressive counterculture at that time. They think that conservative values are and traditional culture are under existential attack from liberalism and progressivism. And this justifies these government interventions like hardline policies, maybe against like LGBT rights, abortion, immigration, DEI, etc., and in favor of their own beliefs like Christianity and pro-family policies. And they differ from the traditional Republicans in taking this maybe to the next level. The state needs to, basically take a more active role in actually stopping what they would consider like liberal, culture, liberal degenerate culture, they would call it, and progressive culture, and actually promoting traditional conservative Christian culture. And we've seen under President Trump, this is the common example we're going to keep giving about national conservative policies. We've seen that the federal government has, defunded, trans or LGBT initiatives that the Biden administration put in. They've ended DEI initiatives, which they've used like progressive, woke sort of policies, and they've promoted Christianity more than the White House created like a faith office. And if you want to look at a even more complete national conservative cultural policy platform, like comprehensive one that's existed, we could look at Orban's Hungary again, where Orban had spent a huge amount of money on pro-child care, pro-natalist policies to convince the population to have more kids. He like cracked down on LGBT civil society organizations, and he promoted Christian education in classes, like teaching Christianity and putting in a favorable light.
Yeah, and speaking of the family and natalism, this sort of is a kind of subsection of the culture war. But one thing the national conservatives care a lot about, probably to a greater extent than maybe some other types of conservatives, is the preservation of the family unit and sort of propagating good values into the next generation by encouraging certain types of families and ensuring that those families have lots of kids. One thing that I would like to make clear before I continue the section is that natalism, or the belief that it's good to have children or good to have an increased population, natalism is not necessarily a right-wing ideology, and it definitely isn't necessarily a far-right one. There are all sorts of reasons to support that sort of philosophy that don't involve the person being a Nat Con or even necessarily being right wing. It's just that there are a lot of Nat Cons who are natalists, but still it is important to make that distinction, I think. National conservatives would say that they support a pro-family culture, and that they want the broader culture to be more aligned towards helping people create families, either ensuring that people can have, be able to afford to buy houses, ensuring that women mostly like stay home to raise kids, that they don't go into the workforce and put that off until later in their years when maybe they can't have as many kids, or when it's just they don't have enough time to do it. And they want these children, of course, be brought up in a conservative traditional culture, which they think will then allow those values to be propagated to the next generation, which of course is why, it's so important to them to have good education policies that go along with this. And by good education policies, I mean policies that, sort of encourage their version of the good, or their version of what the good life is.
Yeah, and we've kind of seen pro-natalist Nat Con policies being implemented, and again, we're bringing up the Orban Hungary example, where Orban has through a lot of money at pro-family policies. I think something like 4 or 5% of GDP was being thrown at social support for families. Something, maybe don't quote me on that. It was something large though, from what I remember. But that was an example of, you know, a NatCon trying to really promote, you know, having more kids. And this is especially, we should understand the context of, you know, most Western countries, especially there's like a demographic decline where people are having fewer and fewer kids, and the population projection are showing countries are going to start declining in population. Um, and maybe the most famous incident I can remember of Nat Cons promoting their pro-natalism, albeit in a very maybe what we could say like aggressive
Aggressive.
way. Yeah, yeah. Way was when JD Vance, I think, called it was a Taylor Swift maybe for being a childless cat lady. I can't remember if that was the person he's calling out, but he called
He
out.
was saying that he was saying our nation is being run by childless cat ladies. I don't know if he called
Gotcha.
childless cat lady by name, but he, I think, might have then gestured at her later in the conversation.
Got you. But that's sort of, you know, that's sort of like philosophy that, like, you know, women who don't have kids are, you know, not really doing their duty. That's a very common one amongst national conservatives. And that's a wrap. Thank you, everyone, for listening to our second episode of our National Conservatism series and our first episode of the NatCon Policy Platform mini-series. Join Jackson and I next time to learn more about national conservative foreign policy and for a discussion analysis of NatCon policies. See you next time.